The reading is from Strength to Love by Martin Luther King Jr. Nowhere is the tragic tendency to conform more evident than in the church, an institution which has often served to crystallize, conserve, and even bless the patterns of majority opinion. The erstwhile sanction by the church of slavery, racial segregation, war, and economic exploitation is testimony to the fact that the church has hearkened more to the authority of the world than to the authority of God. Called to be the moral guardian of the community, the church at times has preserved that which is immoral and unethical. Called to combat social evils, it has remained silent behind stained glass windows. We preachers have also been tempted by the enticing cult of conformity. We preach comforting sermons and avoid saying anything from our pulpit, which might disturb the respectable views of the comfortable members of our congregation. Nonconformity in itself, however, may not necessarily be good and may at times possess neither transforming nor redemptive power. Nonconformity per se contains no saving value and may represent some circumstances little more than a form of exhibitionism. Paul, in the latter half of the text, offers a constructive formula for constructive nonconformity. Be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. Nonconformity is creative when it is controlled and directed by a transformed life, and is constructive when it embraces a new mental outlook. Here ends the reading by Dr. King.
And a much more contemporary voice, Ichioma Oluo, whose book, So You Want to Talk About Race, came out in 2018. She writes, racial oppression should always be an emotional topic to discuss. It should always be anger-inducing. As long as racism exists to ruin the lives of countless people of color, it should be something that upsets us. But it upsets us because it exists, not because we talk about it. And if you are white, and you don't want to feel any of the pain by having these conversations, then you are asking people of color to continue to bear the entire burden of racism alone. Here ends the reading. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the best preachers America has ever had, and there are no imitators, although many have tried. King's was the essence of the prophetic voice, and if you haven't heard his actual voice recently, go find some clips. It's just so powerful. The speaker in the prophetic tradition aims to affect the listener by pointedly illuminating the great chasm between the world as it is and the world as it should be. There is an urgent tone and cadence to this kind of speech, or poetry you could actually call it. It's dramatic and it's captivating, demanding the attention of those who also feel within themselves the gap between what could be and what is. I want you to hear one of the very ancient prophets, the original, Jeremiah, writing in like 650 years just about before the Common Era. I looked on the earth, and lo, it was waste and void. And to the heavens, and they had no light. I looked on the mountains, and lo, they were quaking. And the hills moved to and fro. I looked, and lo, there was no man. and all the birds of the air had fled. I looked, and lo, the fruitful land was a desert, and its cities were laid in ruins before the Lord, before his fierce anger. So I'm reading that, and I'm thinking, that sounds kind of like Bill McKibben, the environmentalist prophetic voice, one of them, right? It's very contemporary, very in a frightening way, right? Traditionally, the prophet is one whom God has called and has troubled deeply in their souls, and who has almost been dragged, if you will, out into the public square to blare the message of repentance to the people. This calling is not sought out by the prophet. It's scary and dangerous and disruptive to their lives. Think about Jonah, if you remember that story. Jonah, who ran away to avoid his calling and wound up swallowed by the whale. The quintessential story of how God is going to get you if God has need of you as a conduit for the holy message. Think of Martin, not swallowed by a whale and spit up on the shore, but hated and threatened in his lifetime and murdered, as he knew he was likely to be. Martin Luther King, fierce and furious, not just about the evils of racism, but about poverty, about the Vietnam War, about white complacency. He has been spit out upon the shore of history, sanitized by white people who conveniently remember only his exhortations to nonviolence and brotherhood, but less acquainted with passages of his sermons and speeches that level accusations of the moral failure and cowardice resulting from taking the spectator's role in the project of democracy. Martin lies upon the shore of memory, a spotlight upon his figure forever. Meanwhile, too many well-meaning white people haven't updated their Rolodex of prophetic Black leaders for at least 50 years. And the term Rolodex already dates me, and nobody has a Rolodex anymore. But let me name some of the Black leaders of today who inspire me. Authors and anti-racism educators, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ibram X. Kendi, Nicole Hannah-Jones, creator of the 1619 Project, Austin Channing, writing about the Black queer experience, Jessamine Stanley, an activist against fat phobia and very famous and beloved yoga instructor who challenges the whiteness of the wellness industry. DeRay McKesson, civil rights activist. Samuel, I know him as Samuel's Way, but Samuel Sinyangwe. He's a Black data scientist and policy analyst who tracks police violence through his Campaign Zero. Activist and speaker Janetta Elsey and Alicia Garza, Patrice Coolers, and Opal Tamiti, who are the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. The Reverend Dr. William Barber, of course, organizer of the Poor People's Campaign, a national movement for moral revival, and so many more. But as Clinton Lee Scott wrote decades ago in his own Unitarian Universalist ministerial context, always it was easier to pay homage to the prophets than to heed the direction of their vision. It is easier blindly to venerate the saints than to learn the human quality of their sainthood. It is easier to glorify the heroes of the race than to give weight to their examples. Prophetic words are stirring and they're exciting, and they fill us with the resolve to do better and to do more, or even to do something. The difficult part is maintaining the fire that we feel when we hear them long enough to do something with that fire. On Friday night, I heard Swampscott rabbis, Michael Rogozin and Yossi Lipsker, speak at a vigil in a cold drizzle in response to the swastika that was graffitied just down the street from here on, I think, Reddington Avenue. I don't know if you've heard about it. Everyone who gathered that night knows that anti-Semitic hatred has spiked in recent years, fueled in large part by conspiracy theories that have taken hold in the imagination of credulous bigots and spread through social media and propagandist media channels. All the words spoken that night were about community, solidarity, and respect. But at the end of the vigil, Rabbi Yossi, who's with the Chabad community, spoke in what I felt was a very prophetic way, because he raised his voice, and he had the microphone, and he raised his voice. And if I can paraphrase somewhat accurately, he basically said, we Jews are not the problem. It is the ones who hate who are the problem. Stop it. Get over it. So he was bringing to my mind the echoes of the ancient prophets. I heard Isaiah, for instance, woe to the rebellious children, declares the Lord, who execute a plan but not mine, and make an alliance but not of my spirit, in order to add sin to sin. The prophets Jeremiah, Isaiah, Amos, Hosea, all important figures in the Hebrew scriptures. They are the foundational voices of the prophetic tradition in Jewish and Christian moral life. And Rabbi Yossi spoke from that tradition as a Jewish leader. Dr. King spoke from it as a Christian leader. The prophetic tradition stands in opposition, or not opposition in the terms of a conflict, but just in a polarity to what we might call the comforting pastoral traditions, which are forms of spirituality that emphasize comfort. The "you are perfect the way you are" teachings. The "love has broken down the wall and all are accepted" messages and practices. The prophets sounded warnings. Woe to you, O Jerusalem. They were not, and mostly still are not, popular people. In the Bible, we're told how the prophets irritated the people by yelling loudly about the consequences of corruption and moral denial. More dangerously, they claimed to be speaking for God, and they weren't offering promises of salvation, they were offering threats. We will be destroyed if we do not change our ways. For this, they were persecuted, imprisoned, and often murdered. And things have never changed for the prophet. They are not in the limelight for long. And when they are under threat by the power brokers, those with what Walter Brueggemann calls royal consciousness. So, of course, associated with the utmost privilege. And by those who are devoted to the status quo, who will go, as we know, to violent lengths to preserve the power structures of the status quo. But there again is that other spiritual movement that threads throughout history as well. The spirituality that is like a warm bath, a pink quartz for healing on the nightstand, a meditation under a blanket in the rocking chair, the breathing of a group of people sharing a yoga or Tai Chi class, a silent retreat, a monastic life, tending gardens. That aspect of the spiritual life is enduringly popular, and it is very, very important. Peace, calm, cultivation of gentleness, connecting with the breath and the body, the strength and inspiration that comes through encounters with nature or the arts, collective spiritual practice. These help us reorient ourselves with the ground of being, the source of all, the love that helps us heed the prophet's call to repentance, sacrifice, and transformation. I can't say that I have found a good balance myself between those modes, but rather I find myself cycling or maybe bouncing between them in a way that can be very wearying, and maybe you can relate to this. Trying to attend to the prophetic call, staying passionately engaged, what can I do, how much can I do, and then getting a little burnt out, a little fried, a little too angry, and then trying to return to the grounded center of quiet, inextinguishable love that our universalist tradition has always claimed is the ultimate reality. Did you see the new sculpture by Hank Willis Thomas of Martin and Coretta King that was unveiled this weekend on the Freedom Plaza of the Boston Common? Did any of you see photos of it? Or maybe did anybody go down there? It's called The Embrace. It was inspired by a 1964 picture of the couple embracing after hearing the news that Dr. King had won the Nobel Peace Prize that year. So many of our monuments to prophetic leaders depict them standing alone in positions of fierce resolve. I appreciated that this one highlights relationship, tenderness, and intimacy, not only because of the specific importance of Coretta Scott King to Martin's life and work and legacy, but also because I see this image as a kind of visual representation of the bridges that we must create between the prophetic imperative and that private and pastoral spiritual life of which love is the center. Love is the essence of that bridge. It is the only connector that we have. There is a diversity, equity, and inclusion trainer named Tammy Triolo, whose work is about the importance of empathy as a foundation for social change. Tammy talks about the inherent violence, even in spaces where we are trying to do the work of transformation and challenge. She talks about violence as an aspect of whiteness. She talks about the competitiveness, status seeking, and status protection, dominance dynamics, and shame and ridicule that white people have, that is part of white supremacy, sort of inner training that white people get from birth. She talks about how that is inflicted by white people who are attempting to examine internal racism and to challenge and dismantle institutionalized racism, how that they use it against each other. And I thought back about a lot of the anti-racist work that I have been doing over the years, and I thought, yeah, okay. When she speaks of the necessity to cultivate empathy, Ms. Triolo doesn't mean that we should try to make the work comfortable, because it can't be. It isn't supposed to be comfortable. But she teaches about this because she wants people to recognize that this is hard, and that it's hard to be human in these spaces. It's hard to sit in that place where we see the chasm between the world as it is and the world as it could be, to absorb some of that agony, and then to say, if we were to get to that other world, things have to change in a way that for a lot of people at that table might really challenge their sense of status and supremacy. If we're not grounded in empathy, in a sense of abiding love, with all that entails, forgiveness, I can't remember the word. Anyway, it'll come to me. We cannot infuse our prophetic ministry with the necessary ingredient of hope, without which there's no point to any of our personal or collective strivings. For underneath the lamentation and the warning of the prophet, there is always a foundation of hope. The renewable energy source of divine creativity that powers us as we build the new land where justice shall roll down like the waters and peace like an ever-flowing stream. Forbearance is the word.